acknowledging that Mass poetry and Salem Mass are on the ancestral territory of the Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Massachusetts, Nomekeeg, and Agawam. Many other Indigenous communities have lived and moved through this land over hundreds of years, and many Indigenous people work and live in these regions today. Let's take a moment to honor these ancestral grounds that we are collectively gathered upon and support the resilience and strength that all Indigenous people have shown worldwide. We at Mass Poetry are intentional about ensuring that events are accessible to everyone attending and involved in the festival. We have closed captions available for this event. If you can't see them, you can turn them on by clicking the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and then show subtitles. If you would like to turn them off, you can choose hide subtitles. For anyone who is depending on auto captions today, to ensure chat messages are not popping up over the captioning, click on chat at the bottom of the screen and it will open a chat panel to the right. If you experience any trouble with this or any other logistics, please send a private chat message to myself or Erica. Regarding Zoom etiquette, please keep yourself muted unless you are invited to unmute by the speakers. There are many ways to interact with each other via the chat and the Zoom reactions button, so please feel free to use them as a way to engage. Please be kind and respectful to the event producers and your fellow participants. We will remove participants for discriminatory or harassing comments, and in such cases, participants may be banned from further festival participation. Thank you for your patience, and we hope you enjoy the event.
All right, is it my turn? Okay, great. Hi, everybody. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you for joining us. My name is Frisia McKee. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a poet, essayist, hybridist, educator, and writing coach, and I'm really excited to be talking to you all about the poetic line. I live in the Midwest on the homelands of the Miami Nation and other Indigenous communities. This is going to be a really interactive workshop. So I encourage you, if you're in the Zoom room, to use the chat to speak up during our discussions. And I know a lot of you are also signing into this through the live stream. So I will share my contact info at the end if there's a question or a comment that we don't address during the workshop. I'd love to connect with you afterwards. You can also visit my website, which is just my name, frisiamckee.com, and contact me through there. So my goal for this workshop is for us to learn more about how poets make decisions about line breaks so that we can make informed decisions in our own poetry about lineation in our writing practice. So what I thought we would do first is to share what we already know about line breaks, right? We all know something about line breaks. We have thoughts about line breaks. So we're gonna just take 60 seconds silently, and I'd like for you just to jot down notes for the following question. I'll share my screen. So what do you already know about line breaks? What do you know about the function and purpose of line breaks in a poem? Anything that comes to mind? And I'll set a 60-second timer and then we'll talk about it. About 15 seconds left, so keep going. 3 seconds left. And that was our 60 seconds. All right, so I'd love to hear from some of you what you wrote down. You can either share verbally, or if you want to type them in the chat, that's great too. So what came to mind?
I hesitate to jump in, but I guess I will, just to break the ice. Line breaks, well, they can complicate imagery, right? They can allow for the changing, a speaker to change her voice or mind or feeling. And pardon the fancy phrase here, but honestly, the first phrase that popped to mind was semantic ambiguity.
Excellent. Great, thanks. Those are all great. Christine, I saw a hand. What would you like to share?
Yeah, the probably the number one thing that I always am trying to think of is how each line can stand on its own. And then to also function as to its maximal potential, where it can, if it can have a double entendre and you're thinking of enjambment, well, it could be one line, but then when you swing it to the next line, it could have a different meaning that goes beyond that. So it's kind of what I try to think about.
Great, great, excellent. Yeah, we're trying to get the most, squeeze the most we can out of every line.
Right.
I saw that Sarah shared in the chat that line breaks can create and impact the overall shape of a poem, right? So that's a great point. And we can think about shape, the many valences of shape, right? Emotional shape, tonal shape, form. We can think about just how it looks, right? Just like the visual shape on the page. Great. Other thoughts? What do we know about line breaks already? Or what questions do we have? Let's free associate a little bit.
I think sometimes you can often look at what the end words are of each line, and then how does that function linearly by just looking at those end words. That's something that was pointed out just more recently that I never really thought about before, but that there's certain readers, particularly I found out, that tend to sort of kind of land on that last word. And when you can kind of see where there's that almost creates another form or meaning when you can read them sort of singularly down the line, down the poems.
Excellent. Yeah, great. So we'll touch on that. I'm so glad you brought that up. Any other comments? Anybody I haven't heard from yet?
Hi. I think it also allows us, it informs the reader how the poem should be read, and it gives a place for a breath. And I think that especially in poetry, as we all know, when the poem is read aloud, it's such a different experience than reading it. And so when you read it aloud, it really helps you know how to read the poem.
Excellent. Great.
Thank
Yeah. So breath, voice, yeah, the vocal aspect of it. And I saw you wrote that in the chat and I missed it. So thanks for speaking up. I also saw that Marianne wrote, can substitute for punctuation in ways which alter syntax, resist closure, etc. Symbolic language is more pliable vis-a-vis line breaks. So well put. And simply line breaks convey outer form. Excellent. Great. Okay, so you already all know a lot. I don't know if you even need to take this workshop, but let's dive in and see what happens. So I'm going to share my screen again, and we are going to start with a couple of vocabulary terms that I'm sure many of you are already familiar with. We'll start there and quickly move on into some stuff that I think you'll probably be less familiar with. So there's two vocabulary words that we usually hear when we talk about line breaks. So the end stopped line and the enjambed line. So these kind of are words to think about what different lines are doing, right? So an end stopped line is when a sentence or a clause ends at the end of the line. So when the line ends, it's the same time that that sentence or clause ends. They coincide. However, an enjambed line is when a sentence or clause continues on from line to line, right? It continues across multiple lines. So I have one stanza of a Lucille Clifton poem here, just as an example. This morning, your grandmother sits in the shadow of Pearl drinking her coffee. So we can see that this stanza is a single sentence, and the first two lines are enjambed, right? Because even though the line ends, the sentence continues on beyond that line. And then of course, that last line of the stanza is an end stopped line because the line ends at the same time as the end of the sentence or the end of the clause. Another way to think about lines is that there's three types of lines, and this is sort of a historical perspective on it, right? So there's the metrical line. So if you think of like a Shakespeare sonnet, right? Iambic pentameter, a line that really depends on meter. The poems we had to read in high school, a lot of metrical poetry there for most of us. There's syllabic line. That's another way that poets, somewhat in the present, but especially in the past, have organized their lines according to syllables. So each line has a certain number of syllables. So Marianne Moore is an example of a poet that wrote a lot of syllabic poetry. And then the third line is the free verse line. And that's what most of us are writing. And that's what we're going to be focusing on in this workshop. So I'm going to share a quote here from Dana Gioia, the poet. Lineation is the central organizing principle of free verse. So I'll say that again. Lineation is the central organizing principle of free verse. We're not leaning on meter. We're not leaning on syllabics. So we really have to focus on what the lines are doing in our free verse poetry. Now I'm going to enter a second paradigm here. And I can't see the chat when I'm doing screen share. So if anything's in the chat, someone can shout that out for me, please. Okay, so here's two more ways for us to think about line endings. This is a really great book, The Art of the Poetic Line by James Longenbach. And a lot of what I'm talking about in this workshop comes from this book. So the first thing that he does is he rejects the term line breaks, and instead he uses the term line endings. And I think that's a really interesting choice in kind of a more neutral or softer way to describe what happens at the end of a line, because if we're going to break the line, we really want to break it, right? So we're talking about line endings instead. So here's two more terms. It's not equivalent to enjambed and end stopped line. This is sort of a different way of thinking about the line. He talks about parsed lines and annotated lines. So the parsed line follows the normative turns of the syntax. The parsed line breaks the line at predictable points, especially thinking about that comment earlier about voice, right? So when would we take a breath, or when would we kind of pause in the syntax? Syntax meaning the building blocks of the sentence, breaking the line at particular points. It goes with the grain of the syntax. An annotated line goes against the grain of the syntax. So it provides emphasis that the syntax doesn't already provide. And so these are different choices we can make to create extra textures, extra musicality. And we're really, really focusing on thinking about the music and sound when we're thinking about parsed lines and annotated lines. Longenbach is also really big on this idea that poetry, and really any art form, especially music, I think, establishes a pattern and then breaks it strategically. So think about repetition and variation, right? So using these different kinds of lines, if we think about the line as the main organizing principle of a free verse poem, we are establishing a certain kind of pattern. There's many ways to do that, many choices. And then we strategically sort of steer the reader's attention in different ways according to where we vary the pattern that we've set up. So neither of these types of line choices are like inherently good or inherently bad. They're just different choices that we can make. All of the different lines in the poem work in concert with one another to create a whole, right? So we make decisions about how to parse or annotate the line depending on what else is in the poem. Let's return back to this stanza, this Clifton stanza. This morning, your grandmother sits in the shadow of Pearl drinking her coffee. So I would say that that first line is parsed because grandmother is already such a huge presence in that sentence that I think that line follows that contour, right? The line emphasizes the word grandmother with it being at the end. And so I think it's parsed. I think it really goes with the grain. But then we have that second line, sits in the shadow of. right? So we're ending right after that preposition of, we're not sure what's coming next. It's really going against the grain. It's creating a different texture. It's not, just following the syntactical units that already exist in the sentence. And then that third line, Pearl drinking her coffee. Very parsed, right? We have a person or a something, we have an action, and then we have an object, right? So it feels very syntactically complete. This is not a science. This is sort of my interpretation of this poem. So as we talk today, maybe we'll have some interesting disagreements about what's annotated or what's parsed. I'm glad that somebody brought up earlier this idea of what I was taught as like, have strong end words to your lines, right? Every single line needs to end with a strong word. And I often wonder about published poetry of the poetry greats, what would happen if they brought it into a workshop? Like, would somebody say to Clifton, this master of poetry, oh, you really should put pearl as the end word of your second line, right? Like ending with that of, it's just so weak. And I think that Clifton made the right choice here. Because if pearl was on the end of the second line, that first and second line would feel so parallel, would feel so similar. So instead, she's creating this texture, she's creating this suspense with kind of keeping us waiting after that of. I see a lot of poems among my students that are only parsed lines, or sometimes only annotated lines. And if you have all parsed lines in your poem, it can kind of make it seem like the lineation is unnecessary. It's like, well, this might as well be prose because the lineation isn't kind of adding anything new that the syntax didn't already provide. So I think it's, that's one of the reasons that this can be really useful to pay attention to. I'm going to share another Dana Gioia quote here. The lineation tells the reader how to hear, see, and understand the poem. The lineation tells the reader how to hear, see, and understand the poem. So I think that's really interesting, thinking about where we want to direct the reader's attention. The end of each line is a turning point, as one of you mentioned earlier, right? So we're always turning to the next thing. But sometimes we kind of just get into a groove where we just try to end each line with the so-called strong word. But we may not be providing the kind of variation that could make a pretty good poem into a really breathtaking poem. I want us to think about line endings, how line endings can create space, how they can build suspense, how they can point out subtext, right? So we're directing attention, how they can lend musicality, and also how they can add double or triple meanings, right? Which is one of my favorite things that I think one of you mentioned earlier as well. So I'm going to briefly pause here and see if there's any questions before we kind of apply this to a poem.
Yeah, I just want to comment that many times when I'm reading a poem, the reader blends the enjambed lines. So the line break is not evident to the listener.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's such an interesting topic too. And I was thinking about that as I was putting this workshop together because this workshop's very page-based, but then I was thinking about what would an auditory version of this workshop be? It's a really interesting thought. Yeah, so thanks for bringing that up. Well, I would like to have us apply this to a poem so we can sort of see it in action. And if any of you are feeling like, I'm struggling to grasp this a little bit, that is okay. We're just here for less than an hour. So we're just getting started. This is just the beginning. So let's apply this to a poem. So what I've done here is label each line with whether it's an annotated or a parsed line. So remember that parsed goes along with the contours of the syntax that are already there, and the annotated line kind of goes against the grain of the syntax. So this is a poem called Rooftop by Javier Zamora. On top of those tiles, they thought they saw stars fall as they imagined snow would from an orange tree. They saw them burst, bright yellow, bright green sometimes, red on the ground, on the roofs, on the streets a few kilometers away, in the islands, in the cane. They climbed the roof when they heard boots flash flood through houses, when they felt the ground shiver, they did not tremble. She held her 2-year-old nephew, saying, Javiercito, they will stop falling soon. It's just snow. So I'm going to walk us through this, and then I'm going to ask you a few questions about this. So you can see in this first part, parse, this first stanza, he's really establishing a pattern here. And then in the second stanza, we're starting to mix things up, right? So they saw them burst. That's a pretty, complete syntactical unit there. But then we have, what we think of as very poetic lines, right? Bright yellow, bright, green sometimes, red on the roof, on the roofs, on the street a few kilometers away, right? So what we're seeing here is that there's different musicality and different rhythms being introduced by those line breaks. And then let's go to the third stanza. So again, we have really complete syntactical units. He returns to the pattern he established in the first stanza. They climbed the roof when they heard boots, flash flood through houses, and when they felt the ground shiver, they did not tremble. And then this last stanza where he starts mixing it up again. She held her 2-year-old. So grammatically, that's a complete sentence. Nephew saying, okay, that's going against the grain of syntax a little bit. Javiercito, they will stop falling. Okay, another parsed line. That's another grammatically complete unit. Soon it's just snow, annotated. So what I want to ask you is, why is this poet making these lineation decisions in this poem? I'm going to zoom out a little bit so you can see it. So we have this text. The lines could have been broken up anywhere, right? And we wonder this too as we're revising our poems, right? Like, should I put this in couplets? Should it be a prose poem? Should it be a skinny poem? Do I want long lines, right? So this is really, we're really getting into this here. So as we look at this poem, why does he set up these patterns? Why does he, decide to craft these different lines in different ways?
I think he's kind of focusing in more in the second stanza, so that it's more, it slows things down for me. It makes them more intense and specific.
Great observation.
He's making a pattern and breaking a pattern, so creating a lot of interest. I think it would be so flat without this this change back and forth, and that one line just really, I think, illuminates what you're talking about, Prisha. That bright yellow, bright. Without that line break, we would read it, quite differently, and it brings everything to life when you can get a line break right like that one.
Great. Yeah, that one stood out to me too. And it's also the first time that he varies the pattern, right? He's established this pattern, and that stands out because, oh, something's different here. Yeah. What else do you notice or wonder about?
Frisia, I know you can't see the chat, so I'm going to read
Please.
David's. David says, I think he first grounds us in a secure image and then unbalances us, then does the same thing again, and then follows up by saying, I mean, secure, quote unquote, syntactically. The feeling behind the images is emotionally insecure, of course.
Excellent. Great. Yeah, so these great metaphors, right? So getting off of balance or disrupting, or right, and that catches our attention. So we return to this idea of directing the reader's attention. Yeah, anytime we're off balance, you know, we sort of push the reader reading the poem, so to speak. Okay, I'm off balance, I'm really paying attention now. Yeah, totally. And you know, as was mentioned before, I mean, maybe this is the stanza that makes this poem a poem, right? It's a really interesting story, certainly. But this is compelling in a really unique way, I think.
I think too, the annotated lines really add to the imagery. Someone might have alluded to this earlier, but that bright yellow, bright green, so it's kind of that bump, bump, which is those images falling, right? So I feel like, and there's that sense again of imbalance, but it's, for me, those annotated lines really lend to the imagery of that extended metaphor of snow or stars falling. So that works for me really well.
Great. Yep, excellent. What would happen if he had decided, or how would the poem be different if he had decided to really construct the third stanza with annotated lines instead of returning to that first pattern?
Well, I think because it's in the third stanza, that at least for me as a reader, I understand the gravity of the situation, which of course I haven't quite gotten a clue from in the first two stanzas, but I understand the seriousness of the situation. In refocusing it on parsed lines, the importance of bringing clarity and presentation of the situation, so that I'm not interested, for example, I could be very interested in a line called or named, "They climbed the roof when," right? Or "They heard boots flash hyphen." Those would be interesting lines, but I think for me as a reader, it's valuable to have the situation explicit.
Mm-hmm. Right. And you know, that's a question or a comment we so often hear in workshop is like, what's actually happening in this poem? Like, you didn't actually tell me where we are or what's at stake here. You know, I love the language. I love these lines are really interesting, but sometimes, you know, in a poem, it's time to really explain this is what's happening. And sometimes a lot of parsed lines are the way to do that, because we don't want to get the reader off kilter. It's like, I'm kind of downloading some information, you know, I'm doing it beautifully, I'm doing it lyrically, but you know, I need you to know where we are and what's happening. Yeah, great. Any other comments? All right, cool. So what I thought we would do next is look at a poem, and I thought another poem, and I thought that together we could label the lines, right? So we get to decide whether we think the different lines in this poem are parsed lines or annotated lines, all right? So I'll read this out loud for us so we kind of have it in our heads. So it's called Epithalamia, which is a wedding poem, wedding-related poem. Butane, propane, and lung full of diesel. I did not stand a chance. Always with poison, breath, bill, responsibility, a man with rote hands. Everything in exchange, rain in a frozen season. Our roofs strung with hot wire, our love was what was, let me say it again. Our roofs strung with hot wire, our love, what was an impression of light gaunt. There is nothing to get. So I didn't make this easy for y'all. I would love for us to sort of start a discussion, and I can, you know, I'll sort of note here and label these lines. Where do you see annotated lines? Where do you see parsed lines? Where are you kind of not sure whether the line is going with or against the grain of the syntax?
I think that the first stanza is all parsed. Although one might argue butane, propane might be annotated, but where the annotated really sticks out to me is always with poison, because I'm really hanging there before you get to breath.
Right. Right. Excellent. So fascinating that these two poems both start with a stanza of parsed lines. Yeah. All right, who wants to grab the baton next?
Parsed?
The breath bill responsibility?
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so we have a list. Well, what's interesting there is if we go across, we have poison breath, or if we just look at that line by, right, she's doing some really interesting double meaning stuff there. If we look at the sentence, it's always with poison breath, bill responsibility. But if we look at the lines, we have that kind of off kilter always with poison, and then that next line, you know, by itself is this list. Yeah, really interesting.
Well, I think the third line looks very much like a parsed line to me. A man with hurt hands.
Right. I see people sort of nodding. Those of you I can see, yeah, I mean, it's grammatically, you know, a sort of, we know who it is and we know something about this guy, right? Yeah. And it's an end stopped line too, right?
I think in the third stanza, my reading would be that it looks to me to be parsed, annotated.
Okay. Oops. Okay, really interesting. Everything in exchange, rain in a frozen season, our roofs strung. Great. Yeah, that third line is definitely feels like it's going against the grain for me. All right, let's keep going. We got 2 stanzas to go.
I would say that in the fourth stanza, maybe all 3 lines are annotated, just because none of them are truly complete sentences, even though there is punctuation at the end of one of them. They're all a little bit, I don't want to say jarring, but they don't end as smoothly, so to speak, as the parsed lines do.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of interestingly, I mean, I agree with that, but you know, in the second line, what was an impression, I think for me, what makes it annotated is the fact that there's that comma. Without a comma, what was an impression would seem to me like a parsed line, but the comma throws it all off.
Mm-hmm. Great. So back to that comment earlier about punctuation, right? And I really think that punctuation and line breaks are very similar on the poetic globe, right? They're neighbors. They can do a lot of the same things for us. All right, and then what about this last line?
Parsed.
So looking at these, so we have 4 tercets and then a one-line stanza at the end, which I think is called a monostitch. So how would the poem be different if she had decided to, form it into a prose poem, or if the whole poem, if it was twice as many stanzas? What is this form? What do you notice about like how this form suits this poem?
I feel a little embarrassed to jump in again, but okay. It's a wedding poem. And so what's interesting is, aside from the fact that I don't see any explicit references to wedding, which I don't need, but it starts off kind of secure, parsed. Then it gets a little insecure. And then it ends up, 4th stanza is completely insecure. I know insecure is a general, but I think you know what I mean. And then briefly, parsed in the very final line, but what's the content of the line? Nothing to get. This is a really unstable wedding poem.
It so is. It so is. Yeah. Other observations just about what's going on in this poem in general? It's a little slippery. It's a little hard to grab this poem. What's going on here? Anything you notice? And I don't have, this isn't a quiz. I don't have like an answer I'm looking for. I'm just curious.
I'm not really sure what the answer is to your question, but I had another comment about how that annotative, the 4th stanza that's completely annotated. When I think of the image of hot wire, I think of a cut wire that's throwing off sparks. And to me, that's what an annotated line is doing here, is throwing off some sparks, some excitement. So the line choices are supporting, I think, the content of the poem, although I'm still not sure what's happening in this poem.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah. Yeah, so that metaphor of a hot wire throwing off sparks is a great metaphor for the annotated line. I love that so much, right? And then we also get our love in that, right? So like, oh yeah, this is about a marriage or relationship, it harkens back to the title, totally. Yeah, it's hard to, I often am thinking about the poet has all of these different options for different things to do in the poem, right? And this is why writing poetry is so hard, because we're thinking about line breaks, we're thinking about images, we're thinking about the story we want to tell, we're thinking about the volta, we're thinking about the emotional tenor of the poem, all of these different things. And so, and we want to balance elements that are really sort of logical and regimented and easy to follow, and then other elements that we're really playing around with, similar to how we're balancing parsed and annotated lines. So this poem, it's a little bit hard to figure out what exactly is going on here. There's a sort of contradiction in some ways, it seems, between the title and the poem itself. But what we can kind of lean against is, okay, we have tercets. So that's really not, okay, I have a pattern here. I know what's coming next. It's very comforting for me as a reader. All the lines are about the same length, which is something a lot of us kind of automatically do without thinking, but that is a pattern that we're establishing, that is a choice to have, all of the lines in the poem about the same length across the page, like some of you were talking about earlier with shape. So there are those elements of continuity in that poem, even as she is, toggling between parsed and annotated lines, and even as, she kind of has this sense of mystery in the poem. Yeah, Christine.
Yeah, I feel like the parsed lines in the first stanza and then strongly in the second stanza with that little brief it almost establishes the voice, and that voice of that sort of, I did not stand a chance. I mean, right away, we're told in that first stanza, like, this is, as someone pointed out, an ill-fated, situation. But then you kind of get to the end and they're talking about your love. And then so there's this, right? There's this, I didn't stand a chance. This marriage is like done. It's just, but there was this love, and so there's this looseness there, and this sort of nostalgia, I think, that the annotated form lends to the voice, where the parsed lines really kind of speak to the reality of the situation. I find very interesting.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, that's a really, really great. Thanks for pointing that out, like that interplay between, establishing the voice and then that reality. I mean, we could look at that, our love, as maybe that's the turn in the poem, right? Maybe that's the transcendent moment, the thing that kind of punches through. And interestingly, that I did not stand a chance, that sort of, I'm building the context, I'm telling you what's going on, is in those early parsed lines, similar to, and these are somewhat two random poems, right? But similar to, okay, we're getting, an orange tree, we're getting some sort of scene setting here at the beginning, right? And as somebody mentioned before too, like, these parsed lines also kind of tell us what's at stake. So that's an interesting example. I did not stand a chance as another moment where the poet is giving us, the password in a sense for this poem. All right, so we're going to keep moving on. What I have done is removed the poet's name and the line breaks from this poem. So what I would like you to do, and I removed the poet's name because it would give you too many clues for where to break this. So what I'd like you to do is you already know where this is going. In your notebook or on your document, copy down this poem, but while you're doing so, insert the line breaks where you think they go. I'll read this for us. Spider web. From other angles, the fibers look fragile, but not from the spiders. Always hauling coarse ropes, hitching lines to the best posts possible. It's heavy work every place, fighting sag, winching up give. It isn't ever delicate to live. So we'll take, I don't know, a minute or two to do this. We'll take about 8 more seconds. And I know we're kind of rushing here. All right, let's look. This is a
Oh, God. Oh, dear.
So, you know, I don't know that any of us have telepathy abilities. Maybe you do, I don't know. But so this poem's by Kay Ryan. And if you're familiar with her work, you might have been waiting for her to pop up in this workshop, Spiderweb. From other angles, the fibers look fragile, but not from the spiders always hauling coarse ropes, hitching lines to the best posts possible. It's heavy work every place, fighting sag, winching up, give. It isn't ever delicate to live. So I want to hear some thoughts about where you broke your lines, why you broke them there, if they were different or similar to where Ryan broke these lines. What was this process like for you?
Well, ending lines on the word "the" is really new to me. So, yeah.
Yeah,
I'd get clobbered in a workshop for that. You know, it wouldn't occur to me to do it, but I would get clobbered. Yeah.
Right. And so, yeah, I mean, that, I feel like that could be a whole hour-long session unto itself, is like, what are the kind of go-to things that we do, that we say, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody else in workshop, like, are you really ending your line on the, you know, and how, what does that mean that I'm always saying the same thing in workshop? And I'm talking about myself here, you know, instead of thinking about all of the different lineation possibilities. I don't know, am I limiting myself in this sort of expansiveness that I could think about a poem, my own poem, or a poem in workshop? Thanks for that. Other thoughts?
I think
Maya in the chat says, I broke the lines at the punctuations, so very different.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and that's kind of another like go-to, which is fine. Christine.
Yeah, and I think only Kay Ryan can get away with this, right? I mean, and it just shows you what we could become so ingrained with. There's no doubt we all have habits or what we've been taught, and you're right. I mean, and she just broke the whole, you know, you talk about going against the grain. Every single line is going against the grain here, which creates the whole poem as an annotated, unstable. And yet that's what's effective about it. So it's interesting because the whole poem is like that. So that's kind of I'm wondering if that's just the point, right? There's the complications, and then the title almost kind of lends itself to that as well. So really fascinating, because I would never do that, right?
Right, exactly. So that could be a great exercise for any of us to do. What would happen if I wrote a whole poem just in annotated lines? You also point out, Christine, the power of the title in this poem. And, you know, I think that if we look for so-called weird line endings, we can find them. Because we remember in the first example, Clifton ended a line on of. And that's another thing in workshop where they, you know, I or somebody else would be like, really? Like, maybe this word would be a better, you know, ending of that line. So I think once we start kind of like scavenging for the weird line endings, we find them. But yeah, you're right. Kay Ryan is like, I mean, this is her thing.
The way you read it, Frisia, this is Patricia talking. It made me think that that it was deliberate in the sense that somehow the spider's action was being replicated. This sort of building and twitching or something.
Great.
A rocking kind of back and forth.
Excellent. Yeah, the mimetic opportunities that we have. So how can we replicate some of our images or movements that are happening in the poem on the page? It's a lesson we can take from concrete poetry, right? So the poem about the moon that's shaped like the moon, or whatever, right? Which can sound cheesy, but it can be really, we can use lessons from that are really powerful. Great observation.
I'm noticing too that most of not all, but most of the lines, depending on how you look at them, they're either lines of 3 syllables or lines of 2 words. That's not 100% consistent on either point, but the patterning, the loose patterning there is very strong, which also, given what was just said too about the sort of the imagery of the kind of the ladder movement of it, kind of argues for going, from other angles, the, fibers look, etc. Not from the. So it's supported in that way too.
Great. Yeah, so even though we aren't working in syllabic lines per se, maybe some of you are, but I think most of us aren't, we can still think about the number of syllables in our lines as another, just as something to keep in mind, right? Something to count, something to notice, something to experiment with during revision. And how are we creating and varying that pattern as well? So I'm going to start wrapping. Oh,
I was just going to add really quickly. I'm glad that you're on the wrap up, because we were going to let you know that you only had 8 minutes left. But there's one more chat comment that I want to be sure you hear, which is from Mary Ann. It says, beginning with heavy work, her choices make it feel just so. Winching up, followed by the long pause before give, feels like a weight, and in such a delicate form.
So beautifully put. Yeah, thank you for that. That's gorgeously put. So, okay, so I'm going to start wrapping up. This has been just a really wonderful discussion. Thank you all. It's really a privilege to be able to talk about poetry with you for an hour. It's not a privilege I take lightly. It's just really wonderful. Also, thank you to the 3 volunteers in this Zoom room, Erica, Cynthia, and May. And I will, I wanted to just share, if you want to get in contact and talk more about this, or if you have questions that weren't addressed, especially for people tuning in through the live stream, my website has like a contact me page, so feel free to use that. You also got permission to briefly share that I'm teaching a summer online class all about the poetic line. So if you just can't get enough, we're going to do a 5-week deep dive into this topic. And I'd love to see anyone in the class who's interested. And you can find that link through my website, or you can go to loft.org and it's in their list of classes. So we have just like a minute or two for questions. If anyone had like any questions or comments about anything we covered that we haven't addressed.
Well, I would say thank you for this. I'm just dying now to go through all my poetry and mess around with the annotated versus parsed lines. It's very cool. The old adage, every line needs to stand on its own. I feel like I need to toss that out now, because every line doesn't need to make some bold statement. I mean, if you look back at Kay's poem, not all the lines are worthy of repetition on their own. So what do you think about that?
That's right. I'll stop the Zoom. So that's such a great question. So going back to Longenbach's thinking about this, he really believes in this idea that all lineation decisions rely on all the other lineation decisions in the poem. So this idea, yeah, I guess like the line is a microcosm. It has to have something in it, I think. It has to be good, right? Like if the line is like, if there's just like not anything there, then maybe things need to be pruned. But yeah, I'm of the mind too that the lineation decisions just rely on everything else in the poem. And that idea of creating the pattern with the line as an organizing principle throughout the poem. If I have a really great line, but it's not speaking to the other lines in the poem, then why is it there? Why is it doing that? I don't know if I hope that answers your question.
It does. I was just looking at that one line in that last poem. I think it's lines to the. And nobody would say on its own that that is a great line, but it's so necessary for the entirety. So I think I see David's writing in the chat, every line needs to do its own work, which that line does. Mm-hmm. I wish you would do, or somebody would do a workshop on what we could throw out of workshops, because I know I'm going to get into trouble for trying all this stuff when I take my writing back to the different workshops I participate in.
Yeah.
These blanket rules that get tossed in your face a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that is so true. And somewhere in my brain, there is a reading recommendation about rethinking workshop, and I cannot, but I know people are writing about it and thinking about it because it is a very particular way to do things. Yep. Yeah.
I hate to break in,
Yeah,
but
please.
it's actually time to close this amazing workshop. I wish it could go on another hour. Thank you, Frisia. It was so great. And thank you all so much. Poets, if you have a website, social media links, or link to a book or a chapbook, please put them in the chat now so that people can follow up with you. Can we get a round of appreciation for Frisia? Hey.
Terrific hour. Thank you.
Don't forget to support Frisia directly by following her and buying her books. There's plenty more amazing programming happening this weekend. If you're interested in attending more events, check out our website. You can also visit the virtual Small Press Fair, listen to the Improbably audio tour, and visit the Fragment Gallery and more. Please follow Mass Poetry on our social media accounts and sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already. The links will be listed in the chat. Any donations go to support not just the festival, but year-round poetry programming. Thank you all.
Thanks so much, everybody. Happy writing, happy listening, happy workshop.